But it's great to be here and to talk to you about a social license for equestrian sport. So this is just an outline of what I want to go through during the time, just to briefly talk about the organisation that I work for, World Horse Welfare. Then just to reflect on, it sounds somewhat corny or trite to say, but the changing world in which we live in, and we certainly do. To reflect for a while, what do we mean by good equine welfare, because I think we so often talk about it, and one of my great fears is equine welfare is often talked about health in the same realms of health and safety. It's a reason for not doing something, and that's so far from the truth. I want to then reflect on the core of what the social license concept means, and then to put that into practice in various facets of an equine's life, to bring it together by something that I've become very passionate recently about, is that I think a big mistake in the sector is the way we talk about equine welfare. And I think we are trying to answer the wrong question, and I will reflect on that before just trying to bring that all together at the end. Now, I'm very happy to take questions as we go through, but in theory, if I don't get sidetracked, we'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So World Horse Welfare as an organisation is nearly 100 years old. Our founder witnessed British workhorses being exported, having worked all their lives on the British countryside in farms, seeing them exported for slaughter to France and Belgium. Her issue wasn't the conditions in which those animals, her issue wasn't the issue that people were eating horse meat, it was the fact that they were being transported in such terrible conditions. And that pragmatic approach is still very much at the heart of what the charity stands for today. We currently work across 4 continents, as highlighted on the map, and we are, as you'll see there, advisors to sport regulators, and that's obviously a key part of what we're to talk about today. But just in terms of looking at what we do as an organisation, as I've already mentioned, transport and slaughter is a core aspect of the work we undertake. We've increasingly got involved in the area of responsible ownership, especially in the horse leisure market, where most horses are involved, as we're going to talk about horse sport. But just to reflect very briefly on working equids, at the bottom there you'll see 6 animals if you exclude the foal, 2 donkeys, 4 horses. That's because in the world, 1/3 of the equines are still donkeys. 50 million are donkeys, 100 million are horses. But 112 million of those 150 million equids are working animals in low and middle income countries, supporting the livelihoods of 750 million people. They're big numbers, and I think a real challenge we face in the equine sector is the fact that so many people are very remote to equines, and they think they are the rich man and woman's plaything. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I think it's a real challenge for us to get that through to society today. On the left-hand side, you can see the different areas of activity that we undertake. So, for example, around responsible ownership, where it talks about intervention, in the UK, we run the largest rescue and rehoming scheme. We take in about 400 animals every year. We rehome about 300 of them, and we've got nearly 2,000 in the homes around the UK. So that's a sort of a very core aspect. And in lower middle-income countries, in 16 of them across the world, we have community-based projects supporting people whose livelihoods are dependent on working equids. But of course, that kind of work, as important as it is only going to get to tens to hundreds, maybe thousands of animals. But when you've got 150 million out of there, you actually need to have a different way of working as well. And that's why, if through influencing we can change policy, we can change legislation, and most critically change the way legislation is enforced, then we can really get to a significant number of animals out there. But of course today we're talking about horse sport and what we describe as responsible horse sport. And that's something we have supported over many, many years. We've been welfare advisors to the International Equestrian Federation, the FEI, since the 1980s. And over the last 15 years have been advisor to the British Horse Racing Authority, along with the RSPCA in the UK. But also informally, we have associations with other national federations. So, for example, a couple of years ago, the German Equestrian Federation asked us to review their regulations relating to equine welfare. And of course, being UK-based, we are members of the British Equestrian Federation. So that, I hope, gives you a flavour for what World Horse Welfare is and the pragmatic but caring approach we take to equine welfare in all its different guises. I think now we just want to reflect on, do we live in a changing world? And I hope you would all agree that we do. And that the reasons for that are multifaceted, but I think the core three, as far as we're involved with today, firstly, the evolution of social media, a wonderful force for good and not so good. And it has transformed communication around the world. And it's given people a voice that they did not have before. And the challenge with social media, you can have a very loud voice, but it doesn't necessarily reflect a very large opinion. And that is a real challenge. Secondly, we live in a world where we're increasingly urbanized. So populations have increasingly moved from the countryside to the cities, and therefore there's been a greater disconnect between all large animals and the countryside issues, and therefore farm animals and equines to boot. And thirdly, there's always been an animal rights activist, animal rights movement internationally, but it's certainly getting better organised, and it's most certainly getting better funded. So I think there's some of the reasons why in the horse sport world we are facing growing challenges, because you and I both know that when we ride our horses, when we are involved in our horses, that is a partnership, and it's a true partnership. But for many people, that's exploitation. And indeed, for even a growing sector of society, where we would say it's use, not abuse these animals, they would say any use is abuse. And a key message from today is we can't simply ignore that point of view any longer if we have done in the past. And of course, because of social media, what happens in one part of the world very quickly happens in another. Only a few years ago, I was at our project in South Africa, in Soweto, 20 minutes after the Grand National Steeplechase race finished at Aintree in the UK. Many of you will have heard about it. But I was asked 20 minutes after the race finished what I thought about the two fatalities in the race that day. So, you can see that we very much do live in a global world. The other challenge we have is the fact that as far as people are concerned, as far as the general public concerned, we have to accept that most of them are ambivalent or agnostic about horse sport. And they are the ones that we need to focus around. And they're the ones that if we lose their support, then the sector is in significant trouble. But crucially, it doesn't matter if we're into dressage, into camp drafting, into endurance riding, or indeed into racing. As far as they're concerned, that's people using horses for entertainment or sport. No different. So we are all sort of clubbed together. So what happens in the world of endurance does impact racing and dressage at the same time. Now, obviously, following the ABC programme last year, there was the Martin Inquiry, and I've just picked up on this conclusion from it. Racing industry in Australia has fundamentally failed to intervene at industry level to effectively protect retired racehorses. Now, they are damning words indeed, which we simply cannot ignore. And I think it's really important also to say that I know there's a lot of frustration that when the media focuses in, or on social media focuses in on something that's very narrow and is not reality at all, that still is public perception. And sometimes public perception does not relate to reality on the ground. But that's still an equal problem as if it wasn't there. But I think I do want to stress that this is not a problem for Australia only. This is a problem for the world, because it doesn't matter whether you're in the US, the UK, Ireland, South Korea, France. There has been bad news stories over the last few months, and we can be pretty sure there'll be plenty more bad news stories in the months ahead as well. And of course, it's most certainly not just racing either, because all sport has come under scrutiny. And we only have to think about training techniques in dressage and jumping, like roll cur and hyperflexion, that have very much come under scrutiny. And of course, some of these headlines, as you can see, the one about the FEI there, are 10 years old. But Hector Carmona here is a Chilean who I think lives in Sweden, but he is running a very, very active Facebook campaign against the FEI and the Spanish Riding School. And here, horse abuse affecting millions of horses globally is going to be known by the entire world It's got to be stopped. Now I know that Hector Carmona, for example, is causing the FEI significant challenges in its communications because there are so many emails and pieces of correspondence coming in as a result of it. So we really cannot ignore it when things like this are happening. And of course, if that doesn't convince you, just turn your minds to the European Jumping Championships in Rotterdam last summer, where Mark Houtziger, the Dutch rider, was in the arena, and two vegan protesters protesting against horse cruelty and horse sport managed to get into the arena. He still did a clear round. He deserves a gold medal for that, as far as I'm concerned. So I hope that shows that we do live in a changing world, and one which is causing great challenges. And it's no wonder that the agnostic or the ambivalent have a negative view around horse sport if all they're hearing in the headlines is these very negative headlines and news stories. But I think we've also got to be quite careful, because I so often hear when, whether it's racing or horse sport, a defence by someone being interviewed is the fact that their horses are looked after really well, which is great and is quite right, and so they should be. But if you put yourself in the ambivalent or the agnostic, their immediate reaction is going to be, well, so it should be. That should be the minimum that you're doing. What else are you doing to support the horses? So I think when we come to talk about communicating at the end, that's a factor we do need to consider. How is the horse world reacting? Well, of course, I know racing in various jurisdictions have a key policy and focus around welfare. For horse sport, it's the FEI Code of Conduct. And whilst that is it was co-drafted with World Horse Welfare, while that is an excellent overview and checklist around which considerations for good equine welfare should be implemented, what federations need to better do across the world is actually take the FEI Code of Conduct and more effectively implement it into their national strategies, because then that is being proactive. Because what else you see here, like the Queensland Government Martin inquiry, or the reaction of in Britain, where the British Horse Racing has just produced a horse welfare strategy, and I know a similar thing in New South Wales, is those could be viewed as fairly reactive. And overall, we've got to ask ourselves, in this changing world, are we doing enough to tell the story about horse sport and what it does for horse welfare? So then let's just reflect briefly on what we mean by equine welfare, and more importantly, what we mean by good equine welfare. Because if we look at the dictionary definition, it quite clearly refers to physical and mental happiness of the animal. And I think for too long the focus has been around the physical welfare of the animals in our care, and not enough about the mental well-being of the animals in our care. And like all areas of life, our understanding of equine welfare is improving. It's changing. Research informs us day by day on aspects of equine learning, equine welfare, equine health, that informs how we should be caring and managing our horses. And so generally, I think we could say the horse world across the world is fairly small c conservative, and we've got to be better at actually being open-minded and actually challenge the way we've done things and the way we care for our animals. Because just because we've done something for years or even decades doesn't necessarily make it right. Taking a step back, some of you will be very aware of the One Health concept. It's especially relevant when we consider the challenges of issues like antimicrobial resistance. But it's very simply that the health of people is interrelated with the health of animals, which is interrelated with the health of the environment. And the One Welfare concept is literally the first cousin of that, where the welfare of our animals is related to the welfare of people, and you only have to look at the number of horses in therapy to consider that, but it's also related to the welfare and the biodiversity of our environment. So if we look at Professor David Mellor from New Zealand, I think he sums it up so well, that it's about giving the opportunities for our animals to thrive, not just survive. It's about giving them not just a life worth living, it's about giving them a good life. And I think we've got to recognise that that is looks quite different to how some people have viewed that what constitutes good animal welfare, and in this case, good equine welfare. And at the heart of it is the horse-human partnership. It is a partnership between us and our horses. And we've also got to recognise that equine welfare is multidimensional. It's not simple, it's not just a tick box here, it's actually multidimensional because there, as we've said, there are physical and mental aspects to providing good animal welfare. And whilst I'm always very careful not to be anthropomorphic, not to impose human values on our horses, we do need to recognise that horses are individuals, and so what works for one might not work for another. And then we could spend all day talking about animal sentience. It's certainly something that's been got the focus in the UK, following on from our departure from the European Union, because in the a treaty of the EU, it does recognise animal sentience. So there's a great debate about how you recognise animal sentience in UK law going forward. But what is at the heart of animal sentience is quality of life. And as I've said, making sure that there's that overall balance of the positive. So if we take a step back and look at animal welfare over the years, without doubt, what has transformed the lives of millions of farm animals, especially, are the 5 freedoms. Established in 1965 in the UK by the Farm Animal Welfare Council, they have been implemented in many, many countries around the world. But a key message from me today is that the 5 freedoms have run their course. They have been brilliant, but they are no longer fit for purpose. Why do I say that? Because if you look at them, it is the avoidance of the negative almost in the exclusively. So freedom from, and therefore the avoidance of the negative. But in reality, we need to be thinking about the 5 domains, which is similar but fundamentally different, because here we're talking about how the nutritional, environmental, behavioural and health needs of our animals all have an impact on their mental well-being and their mental state. So yes, of course it is about avoiding the negative, but as much, if not more, it's about providing positive experiences. Because overall, it's about ensuring their mental welfare is an equal, if not more, of a consideration than their physical welfare. And a different way of looking at that is what sometimes people call the 3 Fs of freedom, forage and friends, because we have to be very mindful where horses have come from in their natural state, and that was to be in herds. They are predation animals, therefore they're flight animals, and they graze for 17 hours a day. So the provision of forage almost continuously throughout the day, the ability to form social groups and the ability to have freedom to roll freely is a really important part of the mental well-being of our animals. And so, having said all of that, I think we just need to reflect on whether we are giving enough consideration to the mental well-being of our animals as opposed just to their physical needs. And I think we need to accept here that our research sort of base around this, around physical welfare, is pretty good. Around mental well-being is not so good. And therefore there is a real requirement collectively for us to invest in more research so we can understand more about what constitutes good equine welfare in this regard. Because all decision making has to be based on 3 factors. Firstly, as far as we can, on the evidence. But the evidence is not always black and white, and therefore where we can't establish it through the evidence, either totally or partially, we need to remember and consider our experience, and we need to remember common sense. How many of us have had a regulation imposed on us which had no common sense whatsoever? But having said all of that, we also need to consider what the public think. Why do we need to consider what the public think if we are doing right by our horses? Because as I said earlier, you have an equal problem. If you're doing right by your horses, but the public don't think you are, then you've got an equal problem. And therefore it is essential for us in the 21st century to be far more mindful of what the ambivalent and agnostic around horse sport think. And that's why the social license concept, I think, is so useful. It's hopefully a different way of us considering how we want to make sure that horse sport in the future thrives. And the concept of social license is nothing new. It's over 200 years old. But it was most recently very much brought back into focus in the late 1990s through a number of mining industries. Because you'll be aware that obviously mining industries send people underground, sometimes at great danger. They also have a significant environmental impact. And therefore, in the 1990s, the more enlightened mining companies recognised that to be successful, to be able to get people to work for them, and to be accepted by the local communities where their mines were, they needed to invest in their social license, which is about trust, it's about being accountable, and it's about being transparent. And from a horse welfare perspective, we often talk about it's about doing the right thing by our horses, which in many ways is nothing new. It's making sure that we are doing the best we can by our horses. But it's also then telling people that you're doing so. And I think another key point to recognise here is, I know some people get very frustrated that with social media campaigns running riot, it can feel a bit like mob rule. Social license is not about mob rule. It's not about reacting to every single social media campaign that happens. But it is about being aware of those campaigns, and where there's something to learn, we take those learnings, and where there's a time to speak up and say that is not true, and be able to put up a justification for why that is the case, that is equally true. But once again, you can't just ignore when there is grave public concern. Because the example we often use is greyhound racing in Australia. If you ignore growing public disquiet about what happens to greyhounds after they've finished their time on the racetrack, then the public and eventually government will intervene. And in one state, for a short while, greyhound racing was banned. And so you can lose your social license. And here, it's not very easy to see, but obviously red is where you lose your social license. I think it very unlikely horse sport will ever get to the psychological identification piece where there's complete buy-in from the community. But I think too often we're in the dark orange, or where the society just accepts or tolerates what horse sport does. But we need to do far more about bringing it down that scale where we can get approval and support for what horse sport does. And as I said, the social license is based on the horse-human partnership. That requires knowledge, that requires experience, and it requires compassion. And of course, within the horse sport world, those three factors generally serve you very well, because it's very unlikely the unknowledgeable, the inexperienced, or the uncompassionate are going to do very well in the show jumping ring or in the horse race, because if we look after and care for our animals well, they can perform better. So there is a bit of a natural check there. But what there isn't is naturally a natural check for their long-term future, because especially in racing, thousands of those animals every year are going to come off the racetrack, and we need to think more carefully about the long-term outcomes for those animals. And as I'll say at the end, I think the horse-human partnership is the bedrock of how we should be communicating about equine welfare in horse sport going forward. So now, just thinking about how we can put this into practice across various facets. It's very easy to overlook, but without doubt, the single biggest challenge to equine welfare across the world is their interaction with humans. And the biggest single interaction failure to support is through how we daily care, and especially how we handle our animals. And so I think we've got to recognise that how we handle our animals has a huge impact on their short and their long-term welfare. We passionately believe there is no such thing as a naughty horse, a badly behaved horse. A badly behaved or naughty horse is only because of that way, either because of their previous interaction with humans, or B, there's unresolved pain in that animal. And it's quite shocking that in the UK, the Animal Health Trust, a very well recognised research institution, did some research 3 years ago in sport horses all the way up to 4-star, and 47%, almost half of those animals which were in active horse sport, were lame. And I think we've got to accept the fact that sometimes, some of them not very lame, but lame all the same. And therefore, we need to really challenge ourselves. Are we giving our horses the best care that we can do? One of my hobby horses, and I know this is rich, fertile territory for Australia, because you have had a consultation through government about whether to have a national horse database, and all I would say to you is, for God's sake, get one, because without doubt, equine ID is the fundamental pillar around which protecting equine health and welfare is based. Without it, you simply cannot do that job effectively. From a welfare perspective, if people fall short of their obligations under the animals in their care, then they need to be brought to account for that. But you can only do that in a court of law if you can link that owner with those animals. And that is a real challenge, especially in the UK, effectively being able to do that. But also, when we have a disease outbreak, and obviously, from the equine influenza outbreak in Australia over a decade ago, but in the UK, we're very worried about exotic diseases like African horse sickness. If an infection like that hits, the first thing you need to know is, where are the horses? If you don't know where the horses are, your ability to control that disease is significantly diminished. And so having a traceable, a proper equine identification system is fundamental for so many different reasons. But it also helps create that database, that data mine of where we can identify risk factors across the piece and understand effectively more what are the better outcomes for animals coming off the racetrack, coming out of elite horse sport. Now, obviously, welfare starts at the beginning, and that's very much with breeding, and it is a real challenge to make sure that the number of animals being bred, there's a market for. And racing often comes under the scrutiny here, where sometimes, in the good times, too many thoroughbreds are bred, and therefore there's not enough of a market for them. And that's certainly the case across all different breeds. But I would say that looking forward, a growing challenge for the sector, as it is across the piece, is equine genomics and the issue of cloning. And whilst obviously in many ways we've been breeding for speed and strength over decades, indeed centuries, we need to be very mindful that we don't breed genetic freaks like this. The canine world has been through that, and very, very painfully. We are in danger of it happening in the equine world as well. So then if we turn to training, I know many of you will be qualified trainers, and there's some excellent, through Australia and around the world, some excellent training programs there, because that competence to train is so important. But if we look carefully, we understand far more about how horses learn, the learning theory. And traditional horsemanship has been very much based around negative reinforcement, and that still has a role to play. Negative reinforcement, you put the leg aid on, for example, until you get the desired behaviour, you take the leg aid off. That's what negative reinforcement is all about. But what we certainly need to move far more towards is positive reinforcement, and that is obviously, as it says, far more positive in its outlook. But I don't know if you've any seen anyone undertake clicker training, which is one example of positive reinforcement. A horse that won't be loaded, or a horse that is needle shy, in 20 minutes, given the right trainer, you can get a horse loading onto a trailer, you can get a horse to be injected. So it's not rocket science, you do need to be competent to do it, but I think we need to understand far more about how our horses learn and make sure we're taking the time to do that. Now, in competition, as I say, in racing, there's welfare standards. For horse sport, it's the FEI Code of Conduct for the welfare of the horse. And it couldn't be clearer. The welfare of the horse should never be subordinated to competitive or commercial influences. When that doesn't happen, as in Ollie Townend in Badminton 2 years ago, on 2 different horses, overused the whip in his cross-country course towards the end because his horses were tired. And that was bad enough. What was worse was the interview that he gave having got off his second horse, where he said, I can win nice, I can't remember the terms, I can either win good or I can win ugly. And so there's many things about that we should take a lesson from. The number one is never be interviewed by the press when you've got adrenaline running through your veins. Now, tight nosebands, I know, is something that has got so much press over the last 12 to 18 months, and indeed before. And indeed, tight nosebands are an issue. But some research we did through with the Animal Health Trust again in the UK shows that actually the real pressure points when you look at a bridle are around a horse's poll and around a horse's cheek, where the major nerve supplies come. So yes, a noseband is important, and a tight noseband, an overly tight noseband, is unacceptable. But the focus should be around bridle fit, not just noseband fit. And we talk a lot about saddle fit in the equine sector and in equine world, but we don't talk enough about bridle fit. And I think that is something that's so important, to make sure that we're not getting blinkered and focused down just because the public says we should to specific issues. You need to look at where the real issues are. And of course, there are all sorts of situations, bitless bridles and barefoot trimming. And again, a lot of these I don't want to call them fads. A lot of these approaches have real merit. Personally, I would never go round a cross-country course in a bitless bridle. It's madness, but some people do. But what we've got to be really careful of is to say one size fits all. It certainly doesn't. So it's not that bitless bridles are good and bitted bridles are bad, because I've seen some pretty poor welfare around bitless bridles too. It's the way we use them, and it's what works for one horse won't necessarily work for another. Now, I don't know how many are involved in racing in the world present here today, but obviously it's a real challenge, and this is probably a great example of social license stroke public perception, because if you ask me what are the welfare challenges for racehorses or racing, the whip wouldn't appear in the top 10. Because most of the time, it can be a welfare issue, but most of the time it's not. But if you ask the public, it's in the top 2. And that hasn't changed for years. The public have a real concern around the use of the whip in racing and the use of the whip encouragement. And I personally believe that the ability to justify the use of the whip for encouragement has gone. I think it's now unjustifiable in the light of public perception. But I'm always slightly wary of saying that, because that's a public perception issue, not necessarily an equine welfare issue. It doesn't mean that the whip doesn't have a role. For sure it does, within safety. And we recognise that racing, in part, and other disciplines have made advancements in the use of a padded whip, in a penalty system. But at the end of the day, we know, certainly from the UK, that the penalty system, in our view, simply does not work at the moment. Not least because jockeys, over the last couple of years, have won some really big races, the Cheltenham Gold Cup, and the jockey has broken the whip rules. How do you explain that to the general public, that someone broke the rules but still won the race? So for so many reasons, I do think the day of the whip for encouragement has gone. So now, just thinking about horse sport, but certainly horse racing, thousands of animals coming off the track every year. And so more investment across the world, which is wonderful to see, is being done in second, third and fourth careers. Because what's so unique about horses is that they can fulfill multiple roles in their lifetime. It can start as an elite sport horse. It can then become a sport horse at a lower level. It can then become a leisure horse. It could then become an animal used in therapy, and actually it could be slaughtered at the end of its life, so it could be used for food for human consumption in the end. That's it's completely unique as a species, and therefore we've got to make sure that at each of those touch points, each of those change points, that the new owners have the competence to be able to look after that animal. And it's not a question of just getting rid of the problem to the next owner, because we know for sure, the evidence shows it, that it doesn't matter if a horse never got onto a racetrack or a horse was bred for sport and never actually jumped a jump. As far as the general public are concerned, a racehorse is always a racehorse and a sport horse is always a sport horse. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, World Horse Welfare, we have a lot of experience in rehoming around 300 a year. A lot of those will be ridden and some of those will be driven. But equally, because of their breeding, because of their background and what they've been through, some of them can't be ridden, and so we rehome them as companions. But I would be very wary to think that retiring animals as companions is the easy option, because their quality of life is just as important as it is whether you ride or compete. And a key message here is that it's so easy to think that quantity of life should outstrip quality of life. Quite the opposite is true, and we need to be very mindful of that. So, all animals, obviously, will have an end of life at some stage, and it is the primary obligation of all animal owners, and in this regard all equine owners, to give their animals a good life, but also a good death. And that is really challenging to think about, especially when we're talking about our own horses, our own loved ones. And that's why for World Horse Welfare, we run an initiative called Just In Case, because it's much easier to consider how you are going to have your animal euthanized and all the implications that go with it in the good days when your animal is healthy, as opposed to in the bad days, at the end of the days when your animal is not healthy. And so to consider, are you going to have the animal shot or injected? What about insurance? How are you going to have the body disposed of afterwards? All of these kind of sort of practical but really important issues are very important to identify so that you can implement it when the time comes. But of course, across the world, it's not always so easy, because there's many countries where there's legislation that impacts your ability to make end-of-life choices. There are some areas where the access to drugs or firearms is not there, and in many areas there's not the competent personnel. And then, of course, in other countries and other regions, you need to consider the cultural and religious sort of challenges. But despite all of that, however we do it, whatever we do, we need to do our best to ensure that our animals are euthanized or slaughtered humanely, and that means by at least as using OIE, International Animal Health Organization standards or higher. Now, it might be odd to come from an animal welfare organisation, but I would say that an outcome of last year's ABC programme does not necessarily mean that horse slaughter is wrong. What is absolutely wrong is inhumane horse slaughter, which clearly that was. And we know that it is a very personal choice. Some people would never dream of sending their horse to the slaughterhouse. But if people do, we don't believe that they should be castigated for doing that. Because if a slaughterhouse has the appropriate facilities and, most crucially, the appropriate personnel, then that is an acceptable choice to end a horse's life. And of course, there are the financial considerations. It is not cheap to euthanize your horse and have the body disposed, and there is a way of getting some return for that end-of-life decision. But clearly that can't be the driver. And one of the big campaigns we ran in the UK a couple of years ago was to make sure that there was CCTV in all slaughterhouses, because that is a way of ensuring, one way of ensuring that actually the regulations that you have in the slaughterhouse are actually implemented. So bringing that all together, there's clearly a balance. On one side, it is not a question of keeping our horses alive for as long as we can. It is about very much considering their quality of life over their quantity of life. But also, on the flip side, it is not just a matter of sending all animals that come off the racetrack and out of horse sport to be euthanized. It is a balance in between. And it's very important that we get that balance right. So throughout all of that, as I mentioned earlier, I think we really do have to be better at challenging the status quo. And two examples, one from racing mainly, is how much wind operations, how frequently we undertake wind operations. I think that's highly questionable in many regards. And equally in all horses, and especially in horse sport, how often joints are medicated, I think deserves a significant degree of scrutiny. But it's all about challenging the status quo. It doesn't mean medicating joints is wrong. What I'm saying is the frequency in which it's done is probably wrong. So we're coming to the end now, and I mentioned this at the beginning. I believe that how we are communicating on equine welfare is often missing the point, because it doesn't really focus on the horse-human partnership, and it doesn't really focus on creating that ethical justification for the use of horses in sport, because it is a partnership, and therefore that's a two-way thing. And we need to actually highlight to people that for those who want to ban horse sport or ban all use of horses, I think some would have a view that horses should return to their natural state, be on the prairie in herds, to be at one with Mother Nature. Now, if we know anything, we know that Mother Nature is not always very kind, and therefore there is no perfection here. It is a balance. We're not saying that because horses can't be at grass the whole time that stables are wrong, but we need to consider how we can give our horses more time at grass, outside, have freedom to roll, etc. So it's about thinking about how that is a team, a partnership, and it's not exploitation. But I think more crucially is we've got to look at it through a different lens. As I said at the beginning, there's no point saying the horse comes first or we do well by our horses, because the agnostic and ambivalent will say, well, so you very well should be. But it's about actually trying to create... two examples I was going to do there was one around British racing, and they had the Horse Comes First initiative, which actually some really good stuff has come out of that in terms of what British racing does to support, and indeed all racing jurisdictions do, support equine welfare. But the Horse Comes First, to me, is totally the wrong title, because people would expect that as a minimum. And I also think, quite rightly, especially in jumps racing, which I know is not very common in Australia, but in all racing, there's a real focus on fatality rates. So there should be, and catastrophic injury rates. And some really good work is done to bring that down. But we need to be really careful about how we utilise that in our storytelling to the public. Because, to be very direct, to say that you killed less horses this year than you did last year is not necessarily a very good justification for the use of horses in sport and in racing. So I think we need to do that because we know we are not in a zero-risk sport. We know there will be bad days, and therefore we need to create a different narrative, a different story, build greater trust with the public about the care that goes into horse sport and the horses involved, because we know there will be bad days, but there will be good days too. And those who care for their horses within elite horse sport and racing the best, most of the time, they will be the ones that get the best results. And I think especially in horse sport, we need to consider, in terms of how we communicate and how we advocate for change, is the use of ambassadors. When Ollie Townend did what he did at Badminton 2 years ago, I would suggest that there are people on their little pony at the weekend who are going round their cross-country course, and where their pony gets a little tired, they may feel that they've been justified in giving it a one crack too many, or one crack at all, because that's what the top riders do. So I think in terms of getting to where the most horses are, which is in the local shows and the local gymkhanas every year, there is a real leadership role to be played. And so the Mark Todds, the Andrew Hoyes and the Pippa Funnels really do have a role to play there, because a key point is, for around the social license concept, is no one can divorce themselves from it. No one can say, I don't have a part to play, because the reality is we all have a part to play. So as I mentioned earlier, I think in terms of where we go from here, there is a real challenge around actually investing in more research. That's not just around the equine welfare aspects and the scientific research there, but it's also about public perception, because we need to have a better understanding what the public think, and therefore we can, in terms of how we tell the story of horse sport and what we do for horse welfare, you can only create that story accurately if you know what people think. And I think one of the things that you so often hear, and I say it myself, is my horse loves this. My horse loves doing this, or my horse loves doing that. Especially one that's coming back from injury and you get it out onto the cross-country course or into the dressage arena. But I think, whilst I absolutely think that's true, I think the scientific justification for it is somewhat shallow. So I think we need to do more and develop more understanding about what the true benefits are for our horses. So to bring that all together, I hope that has just shown you what we mean by social license and how the concept is very relevant to all of us in this room, and how it's about putting the horse first in everything that we do and making sure that we tell people that we are doing that, because it is this collective responsibility. As I touched on at the beginning, I think we have got to constantly challenge ourselves the way we are doing and handling and caring for our horses, because our understanding of equine welfare is changing and we need to change our management practices as a result. And finally, we need to recognise that this is a lifetime commitment. When we breed horses for sport and for racing, as far as the public's concerned, once a racehorse, once a sport horse, always so. So we need to make sure we manage that responsibility for the entirety of the horse's life. And above all, we cannot simply kick the can down the road. Euthanasia and slaughter are very difficult concepts, but that doesn't mean we can divorce ourselves from it. We always need to place quality of life over quantity of life at the heart of our decision-making process. Thank you very much indeed.